So we'll be exploring Braintree and what it was like in the 1920s and 30s. I'll be doing that in three parts. So first of all, I'll be setting the scene. So what the country was like during that time, as well as giving a bit of background of why we put the Art Deco exhibition here at Braintree together. Then we'll look at the big three. Sounds like an Agatha Christie novel, so very apt. But more on that later. And then finishing with a kind of chronological timeline tour of iconic Braintree buildings and locations in the town. So let's set the scene. So Britain during the between the wars, I should say, so interwar Britain was a time of transition and great change. So the Victorian social and cultural conventions were completely lost with much of its industry, its housing, and its social conditions. Although there was political transformation and economic hardship during that time, Britain was very much moving towards an affluent mass consumer society. So this period saw a general improvement in the quality of life for the majority of people in the country, despite that the 1930s was blighted with mass unemployment and appeasement. Most British people had a better standard of living with higher wages, shorter working hours, and longer holidays than the generations before them. They would have enjoyed more of a disposable income, new consumer products such as radio sets, going to the cinema, electrical appliances, and motor cars, as well as more freedom of expression in style, art, architecture, music, and socializing. A main cause for these improvements was changes in population structure. Women who had worked during World War I gained new rights because they got the vote for all women over the age of 21 in 1928. There was also a fall in the birth rate that resulted in a reduction of the demands on the average family's income. So those really had changes for the people. Families moved to newly built suburban homes, and leisure time became a growing part of ordinary life. Now, although there was an awareness of big class divisions across the country, especially between the North and the South, as well as a looming depression, Braintree, interestingly, with its industries, although they really struggled, still managed to keep their head above water, providing work as well as innovative new products and designs coming out of very successful and pioneering companies. Now, what sparked our Art Deco and Beyond exhibition is actually a multitude of elements, mainly Silver End being 100 years old this year, brainchild of Braintree business Crittalls. But Art Deco is also a century old, initially launching as Jazz Moderne at the Paris exhibition, pictured the poster on the left of this image. Interestingly, the name Art Deco also came from the title for this exhibition. They shortened Des Arts Décoratifs into Art Deco quite a lot later. As mentioned, it was first known as Jazz Moderne. And it is at this exhibition, as well as the British Empire exhibition at Wembley, the plan for that photo on the right, is where not one, but three Braintree companies, which I've named the big three, exhibited at the same time. Crittalls, Crittalls, and Warners and Sons all had stands at these exhibitions, which I personally find absolutely amazing that a relatively small and rural town in Essex had not one, but three major businesses at these global showcases. The opening of the Wembley exhibition by the King was even shown at the Picture Palace on Fairfield Road here in Braintree and was so popular they kept it showing for a week. So that just really shows the impact of these businesses. Now, on to a bit more about these big three. So starting with Crittalls. In the 1920s and 30s, Crittalls was managing two different businesses, that of artificial viscose yarn manufacture dating from the 1905, based at Coventry and expanding rapidly with new factories built in the Midlands and the North, as well as the traditional weaving that dates all the way back to 1825 here in Essex, specifically Braintree, Bocking and Holstead. The company's focus on pioneering the production of artificial silk in the early 20th century was a successful move that provided a degree of resilience and employment during an era when traditional silk production was in complete decline. Because by 1922, the company's production of real silk materials had declined to 1/3 of what it had been before 1914. This is because from 1860, Britain became the only free market in the whole world for silks to be imported completely for free. That meant that over £23 million worth of foreign silk goods came into this country, putting a huge strain on national produced silk. So these struggles led to the company very quickly and cleverly switching to a period of industrial development of the new artificial fibres that were being explored, as well as international expansion. A new era of fashion really supported this expansion. So the dropping of hemlines and the loosening of waistlines was really kind of revolutionary, not only in the way people wore things, but also the way things were made. These styles of clothing required a lot less fabric than the kind of Victorian outfits that were being made, as well as artificial silks being a lot cheaper and more readily available, meaning that the majority of the people making these clothes at home, the women, could afford more than just their Sunday best dress, as well as for their children. By 1930, Crittalls rayon yarn production increased by 99%, which is incredible. And the company's capital then was worth 32 million. I don't even want to think about how much that would be in if we transferred that to today's money, a lot. And rayon would soon be worn by everyone in the modern world, and it changed wash day forever. The Depression hits, and while the textile industry suffered significant job losses, interestingly, two Essex firms withstood the strains because of their strategic position in the market, protective measures, and expert skills helped them maintain a substantial workforce. And that was Crittalls and Warners and Sons. More on Warners shortly. Generations of the Crittalls family were notable figures and generous benefactors to the towns that they had their mills. And during the 1920s and 30s, there were a couple of Crittalls leaving their mark, not only in Braintree, but also nationally. The first picture, Samuel Crittal IV, became chairman of the Crittal Company in 1921 and is mainly remembered as the founder of the Crittal Institute of Art, to which he gifted his magnificent modern art collection. Below you can see a small version of Vincent van Gogh's Peach Trees in Blossom. Interestingly, this painting was shown at Silverend Village Hall when there was a national campaign kind of backed by Samuel Crittal to get these modern art pieces out to the nation and the smaller rural areas. So a lovely kind of collaboration between Crittalls and Crittalls there. Then we have Stephen Courtauld. He was a keen mountaineer and patron of the arts. He owned and was responsible for the Art Deco style wing at Eltham Palace in London, and accompanied his cousin Augustine on an expedition to the Arctic in the 30s. Next picture is said Augustine Courtauld, and he can be seen as one of the most daring explorers of his day. In 1930, he joined an expedition to investigate if an airline route could be established between England and Canada, with Greenland acting as a refueling station. One of the first tasks to complete was setting up a meteorological station on one of the ice caps to measure and record the weather. Arriving at the station to relieve the men that had been setting up, it was found there was actually only enough supplies left for just one person, not another four. Augustine offered to stay on his own, and for the next 5 months, he remained alone at the station, diligently taking measurements until he was actually forced to give up his efforts when snow completely blocked his entrance and exits of his hut in March of 1931. During this, which must have been a grueling time, he held firm to his belief that fellow explorers would rescue him. And finally, 2 months later, end of May, they managed to locate the station and free him from the snow. The picture below is the date of his rescue. And then finally, William Julian Courtauld. He was a local politician in Braintree, and his legacy is probably the most visible. The cottage hospital he had built in Bocking was moved to London Road in 1921, and that was also financed by him. Other gifts include the gymnasium on the Causeway and the sports ground and pavilion off Coggeshall Road, a district nurses' home and almshouses at the end of the High Street, the fountain by St Michael's Church, and of course the town hall. More on all of those shortly. He built a home for himself in 1926 on the site of Queen's Meadows, just off Bradford Street, which was later lived in by Valentine Crittall. So again, a bit of synchronicity there and crossover. Courtauld's combination of industrial innovation, financial prudence, and cultural patronage ensured its impact on both the textile industry and the arts, leaving a legacy felt locally, nationally, and internationally. So a huge, huge impact. Then we move on to Crittalls. Now, although the making of metal window frames date back to Tudor times, the development of the industry as an engineering process and mass production was completely led by Crittalls and saw significant growth in the 20s and 30s. This led to expansion all over the country, and throughout the 1920s, Crittall factories were founded around the world, such as Japan, Korea, China, and India, and Braintree men set up factories in New Zealand and Australia. Pictured here, you can see the Crittall Manor Works in Braintree. So this is the entrance that you can see on Coggeshall Road, and to the left, it's the double roundabout and Station Road. Just to kind of place that for you. It's now flats. It's been completely torn down and turned into flats. By 1924, Crittalls and their families accounted for some 60% of Braintree's inhabitants. And this meant that Francis Crittall had a housing crisis on his hands. Braintree Urban District Council actually refused him expansion of Clockhouse Way, where he had already developed a total of 65 houses in a completely revolutionary and modern way for 1919. Now, I can't not mention Clockhouse Way, even though it was built in 1919 and we're looking at the 20s and 30s. But these home fit for heroes pioneered many firsts. They were the first modern style buildings anywhere in this country and were the forerunners of modernist architecture. They were also the first to be designed on a metric grid with units of standard size, introducing the concept of system building to England. And they used the now standardized cottage Crittall windows. And finally, it was one of the first developments in the UK that put the needs of the occupants high on the list of priorities. Now, interestingly, after being refused this expansion, Francis Crittall kind of changed his tune and stated that he associated any kind of suburban expansion with the slums of the big cities, and therefore set out to find somewhere completely new. He now had a vision to develop a community of Crittall families enjoying the amenities of town life in a lovely rural setting, and somewhere everyone's needs would be met and no one needed to travel to find the services they required. A suitable location was found in late 1925 at a village about 4 miles from Braintree called Silver End. At that time, it probably had about a dozen scattered cottages and a couple of pubs. The land was purchased and the creation of Silver End started in 1926. In a 5-year plan, there were 100 houses to be built each year, all with the requirement of having large gardens. The project was partly funded by the Crittal Building Society, into which employees were encouraged to invest their savings. The Silver End Development Company was then set up to build the village and employed a team of about 300 men from all over the country, as well as, very importantly, employing a variety of award-winning architects to create the look of this utopia. Silver End had the first and only large group of modern movement houses, and at that time was considered revolutionary in that not only were the houses of modern design, they were built with proper sanitation, electricity, and running water. And because they hired a multitude of award-winning architects that were split up over the town, which you can kind of see with this first slide that I showed, the very kind of modernist and square-looking homes in comparison to the slightly more traditional-looking homes. So it wasn't all completely modernist. It was a mixture of architectural styles, which did make it feel very much like a village. But all of them had, as I said, the proper sanitation, electricity, and running water. Now, throughout the 1920s, Crittalls made major advances in both manufacturing and employee welfare. The company secured the British rights to an important rust-proofing system, obviously improving the durability and corrosion resistance of their windows. Crittalls also introduced forward-thinking policies for workers and their well-being. A personnel department advised management on machinery, training programs, and safety measures. The factory that was built at Silver End was specifically designed to supplement the Braintree and Witham works by producing smaller components such as latches and handles. Valentine Crittall intended the new factory to provide opportunities for disabled workers, especially ex-servicemen, and at its peak, 90% of the Silver End workforce had a disability. And these pictures were featured in the Crittall magazine highlighting that work. A safety committee was formed in 26, and the company dentist was employed for both the Braintree and Witham works, as well as a work doctor and 2 nurses appointed a bit later. The welfare department produced the famous Crittal magazine and actually proposed reducing the working week. In 1926, Crittalls became the first large company to introduce a 5-day week without cutting pay. And this boosted the productivity of the employees because they returned more refreshed from having had a weekend. The company also established numerous benefit funds to support workers during illness and to assist widows and retirees. In 1923, a sports ground for the community was opened on Cressing Road. The grounds were said to be the finest of the country, and besides a football pitch and grandstand, it also offered facilities for cricket, hockey, tennis, and bowls. In 24, employees from Braintree, Whittam and Malden were invited to go to the Empire exhibition at Wembley that we mentioned at the start. Crittalls put on 2 trains to transport the 1,250 workers to Wembley. Bows and rosettes of orange and blue, the company colours, were worn by all. The company paid towards lunch, and 2 nurses travelled along in any case of emergency. And buses were also chartered to take people back to the more rural homes from the stations when they returned. By 1930, company profits allowed, interestingly, Crittall to purchase the financial and editorial control of the Braintree and Whittam Times. The Depression in the 30s did affect the production of metal window frames at home and abroad. And in 1923, the Whittam Works had reduced to a 3-day week, whilst at Braintree, large numbers of employees actually had to be laid off. This also meant the selling off of assets in Silver End to keep the business as well as the village afloat. The company bounced back, though, and by the mid-1930s was securing vast numbers of notable contracts, such as Broadcasting House, pictured here on the left, and the Adelphi Hotel in London, as well as the head offices for Boots, pictured on the right, and John Player Cigarettes, both had locations in Nottingham. However, for Silver End, it was pretty much the beginning of the end. And in 1968, the village was put up for sale by the company, with thankfully Braintree District Council purchasing it in its entirety, understanding the historical significance and need to rescue it. Now moving on to Warners and Sons. During the 1920s and 30s, Warners and Sons produced a range of products, including luminous textiles inspired by places like Egypt, China, and India, a huge influence on the Art Deco movement. This was made possible by improved methods of dyeing rayon and mixing both natural and synthetic fibers together. As a result, more exotic designs were able to be readily and easily produced, reaching a far wider audience. While hand-woven silk textiles were the backbone of Warners and Sons, the firm also traded in printed textiles. In the 20s, demand for printed designs increased, and the less expensive medium allowed for greater experimentation. Warner and Sons responded to this customer preference by increasing their printed output with modern patterns, and also purchasing a printing factory in Dartford, Kent in 27 to produce their own rather than relying on specialist printing companies elsewhere. A major change in the way Warner and Sons operated in this period was the introduction of power looms at the Braintree mill. These looms were very effective, manufacturing textiles at a much quicker rate than hand looms, and over time allowing for greater production of some of the beautiful designs that can still be seen today and on display in the exhibition. Like Courtaulds and Crittalls, Warners very much looked after their workforce, and many annual celebrations, dinners and outings for the workers were organised. In 1920, a dinner was organised at New Mills to welcome home the men from the company who had served in the war. 150 people attended, and Sir Frank Warner proposed the toast of "Welcome Home," also mentioning that 50 of their men went from the factory to save the nation, some of whom would never come back. A war memorial was unveiled at the New Mills site, and this now stands at St Michael's Church. In 24, Sir Frank Warner also invited his staff to visit the British Empire exhibition and to see the company stand there, as well as enjoying a luncheon, which was paid by the company. 230 in total made the journey by Charabanc, as pictured top right, that were put on by the company. In 25, the second annual Warner's Sports Club Social was held at the Institute. with 240 attending, celebrating the working man's sport. These included angling, bowls, and football. Music and dancing were arranged and enjoyed till deep in the night. So that's part two, and now we'll move on to exploring what Braintree town was like, as I said right at the start, in a kind of chronological order. So first, we will start with the Braintree and Bocking Institute. So the Braintree Institute was created way back in 1845 by George Courtauld as a place for providing entertainment for his workforce. By 1932, there were over 700 members that enjoyed going there. A lot happened between the 20s and 30s at the Institute. A couple of them are that the Braintree Amateur Dramatic Society obviously would have put on a host of displays there, including a very well-received performance of The Skin Game in 1924. Newspaper reports said it was one of their best. In particularly stood out as one of the props was a metal French window, which had kindly been loaned by Crittalls. As you can imagine, several dances were held in the Institute over those years, including jazz dances. And in October 1920, it was accompanied by the Constitutional Jazz Orchestra. 5 years later, a cabaret dance was held and attracted people from all over Essex. And in 1929, a Rogues and Vagabonds ball was held, which sounds absolutely amazing, aiming to support actors in need. And this also, again, attracted many actors of note of that time. Talks were a popular event at the Institute, and in 1928, Harold Abrahams, 100-meter sprint Olympic champion, who the film Chariots of Fire was based on, came to the Institute and spoke about his success. Interestingly, part of his talk focused on his dislike of female runners because they weren't quite built that way, according to him. And he also believed there was a good reason why women had been banned from watching the Olympics in the past. Not sure if that could fly now. There was also a very interesting lecture and demonstration given by a Mr. Reverend W.R. Harvey on the uses of the radio in 1924. And at the end of his talk, the first recorded exhibition of broadcasting by wireless at Braintree took place. And at Castagnoli's wireless works on Panfield Lane, a William Few played a cornet into a microphone, which was transmitted and heard at the Institute on the radio, which I can imagine must have been thrilling and very exciting. Moving on to Electric House. Now commonly known as Electric House, this building stands at the kind of crossroads between Rain Road and the Causeway or Bocking End and Coggeshall Road, so kind of where the White Hart is. It's quite an iconic and big building in town. But it was originally called Twyford House and was owned by a Mrs. Nelson. Interestingly, by marriage linked to Lord Nelson. Went down a rabbit hole with that lady. But she passed sadly in 1916, leaving the property unsold and dilapidating. With a growth in the use of electricity, the East Anglian Electricity Company saw an opportunity with this wonderful building and opened a shop here in 1920, naming it Electric House. According to reports, it boasted of competent staff of electrical engineers able to assist with all kinds of inquiries for electrical installations, either for lighting or power. It also boasted of beautiful showrooms filled with the most modern electrical fittings, ranging from toast racks to electric irons for the laundry and radiators to warm a cold room. The company also interestingly used an electric current from a generating station supplied by Lake and Elliot, where surplus energy could be distributed and sold to local homes and businesses. So there were two wires that were specially built and laid to convey this electricity, and one ran from Lake and Elliot's on Chapel Hill to the Bocking side of Coggeshall Road, and the other from Lake and Elliot's to Victoria Street. The advantages of electricity were praised in one advert from 1920, which listed the pros of installing it in your home, and I will list them to you now. Number one, no dirty ceilings. Number two, no striking matches. Three, no smell. Four, no accumulation of dirt in the living room. And five, convenience in switching a light. It also argued that Braintree needed electricity in order to be brought up to date with other progressive towns all over the country. And many local businesses, including the Swan and Horse and Groom hotels, quickly installed it, as well as several shops in town. Then we have the Central Cinema. Opening at the end of the 1920s, and at the end of the High Street in 1921, I should say, the Central Cinema was actually built by a local builder. And by 1929, it was run by the cinema circuit owners Shipman and King. It was intended to be a very high class and up-to-date cinema with a seating accommodation of 800. And besides the films it showed, there was an excellent orchestra and a lovely little cafe upstairs. Sadly, in 1957, the cinema closed for good, turning into a Tesco supermarket. And then 30 years later, it was purchased by Town Row, who many of you will know had a store there until 2017. I think the main image is one of my favourite, looking at all the employees proudly standing outside and seeing what films were showing, as well as the Rudolph Valentino cinema poster. It's magnificent. The one picture of the building on the left is slightly later. It's just before it closed, but it gives you a good view of the modernist style of the building. So here we have a wonderful kind of bird's eye view of Braintree in 1920. This picture was taken of in 1920. And in the centre there, you can see St Michael's Church. And as you can probably see, the fountain is not yet there, and the space in front of the church is filled with buildings, as well as kind of opposite the road there, there being a lot of buildings as well. This is obviously also before the kind of creation of Pierrefitte Way and the expansions of the road there. But absolutely fascinating to look at. The area that I want to focus on is the area that I mentioned just across the road, which was known as Martin's Yard. And in the 20s, nationally, there was a primary focus on building new homes. But many working class families that couldn't necessarily afford to move into these new homes were still living in very dangerous, overcrowded conditions with poor sanitation. By 1925, there was increased pressure on local authorities to tackle these living conditions, with various housing acts used to address the so-called slum problem, mainly by rehousing inhabitants and then pulling these buildings down. Martin's Yard in this area of Braintree was a notorious part, known for its slums and lack of sanitation. In 1922, the local medical officer condemned the area as appallingly overcrowded and wished that an earthquake would come along to finish the area off. In 1930, the council invited tenders to come forward to demolish the area, and in October of that year, much of the area was cleared to allow for the high street to be widened. By this stage, the cottages there were unfit for human habitation, as well as the shops that stood alongside them, and therefore unfit for modern day Braintree. Discussions were had about what to do with the site, and a library and a public reading room were considered, as well as a public swimming bath that was set to be built there. But that eventually didn't actually follow through. And in 1939, architect Vincent Harris was instructed by William Julian Courtauld to design a district nurses' home as well as almshouses beside it. Now, this picture is actually of the opening of the fountain. The fountain wasn't actually built till much later, but it's the only kind of image that we have of the almshouses having recently been built, as well as the nurses' home, which is just out of shot, but still a wonderful photograph of its time. Then we have the Crittal Social Club. In October 1926, the Crittal Social Club was officially opened along Coggeshall Road, and a lunch was given by Francis Henry Crittal to 300 guests. The club itself was built of brick and steel with the metal casements, obviously courtesy of the company. And inside there were 2 directors' rooms, dining rooms for staff, a billiards room, lounges, library, 2 card rooms and a bar, as well as a main hall, which could seat 600 people. There were 2 multicolored glass lamps that adorned the space made by Crittal staff in their spare time, and as well as 2 very unmissable, beautiful earthenware vases that you can see pictured here, standing by the front doors. Numerous events were obviously held at the club, including a party for female employees in 1927, and the first ever since the opening of the club. 200 people attended, and the hall was decorated with a huge C, and electric lights in blue and orange decorated the hall, making it look very sparkly and pretty, as reported. In 36, there was the Crittal Athletic Football Club dinner, and according to reports, the main hall was redecorated with a lot of footballs, and it was the first time that women had been invited to this dinner. Sadly, the club closed in early 1990s and made way for housing. Then we have the recreation ground. Following the First World War, there was a concern about the health amongst British workers. As a result, many local authorities were actually determined to promote exercise, and recreation grounds began appearing across the country. In May 1927, one of these opened in Braintree by Sir Kingsley Wood, Parliamentary Secretary to the Ministry of Health. In his speech, he stated, "We suffer greatly from our sedentary lives, the indoor atmosphere, and the city life." Braintree's grounds had been funded entirely by public donations, with William Julian Courtauld promising to double them. The grounds boasted of a range of facilities with hard tennis court, pitch for cricket, football, quoits, a children's playground, and a pavilion. The Braintree coat of arms and Bocking dolphin decorated the pavilion because, with the hope of placing the recreation ground in Bocking, it would hopefully unite the two places. At the opening ceremony, flags were flown across the town and a guard of honour stood at the entrance gates. A cricket match between Braintree Town and Crittalls was played, and an American tennis tournament with dancing following until dusk. More facilities were built in 1928 with a new football ground and a squash court. The squash court was apparently one of the best in the country. Obviously, some form of a match had to be played, and Crittalls and Courtauld's football team played each other, with Crittal winning 3-0. The grounds are still open to the public today, but the pavilion was demolished in 2019. The iconic Town Hall. The Town Hall was opened in May 1928 by the Earl of Crawford because Winston Churchill wasn't available. He had been invited but was busy. Architect Vincent Harris, who also designed the nurses' homes and almshouses and the pavilion at the recreation ground, must have made a huge impression on William Julian Courtauld because William Julian's only condition for funding the building of the town hall was that he could choose his architect of choice, which was obviously Vincent Harris. The town hall served as a meeting place for the Braintree Urban District Council. And most notable, in 1931, history was made when Emma Mabbs was elected as the first female vice chairman. And she is sitting just second from the left amongst all these very imposing men. She looks fabulous. And 2 years later, she actually became the first female chairman by unanimous agreement, which again is fabulous. Over the past century, the town hall has remained a reliable structure in town, with the clock chiming the hours. In fact, the bell was named Constance Cicely after William Julian's wife. However, it didn't always ring without mishap. In December 1929, the clock began striking at 4 a.m. in the morning, waking up the town's residents as far away as Bocking. According to one report, people counted 92 strokes before the man in charge of the bell, who luckily lived nearby, was able to leap from his bed and up the tower to fix the problem. And this is one of the first photographs taken from said tower, and first views of Braintree in the 1920s. Again, such a phenomenal photograph and amazing to have. The Masonic Lodge. In June 1932, Brother John Burgess Howard died at the age of 42, leaving a large amount of money to his fellow brothers. And this was specifically to be used to build a new meeting lodge to be named Howard Hall after him. A year later, the foundation stone was laid in Bradford Street with much ritual, with Sir Frederick Senier, the Assistant Provincial Grand Master for Essex, when he poured oil and wine and strewed corn as a symbol of peace and plenty over the site. Over 100 people attended this event, and tea was served in a marquee afterwards. This is an amazing picture of very notable Braintree Masons all together at that ritual. The modern Art Deco design of the building was done by Sir John Burnett of Tate and Lorne Architects in London, in conjunction with Braintree's own builder, Mr. D.G. Armstrong. And obviously, Crittalls supplied the steel casements and metal gates. It had all the mod cons, with a treble gas cooker and carving table having been donated by the Braintree and Bocking Gas Company. It had electric lighting throughout, and there was a grand entrance hall, committee room, lodge room, kitchen, offices, and a dining room which could seat 120 people. The Bank Street development. Now, with the rise of the motor car in the 1930s, there was a real need to adapt access in Braintree town centre, and several schemes were set to widen Bank Street, which was originally one of the narrowest in the town, as you can see on these two pictures. It was narrow because there were buildings just in front of the Swan pub. So there was a kind of little street between the buildings that you can see on the left with that garden, as well as actual Bank Street. So those houses and buildings were demolished to widen Bank Street, because car parking was also becoming an issue, as planning and placing suitable locations for cars was a challenge. So this is after the widening and the removal of those buildings. And on this street, Bank Street, the council put down lines for car parking, which you can just about make out on the left-hand picture, where those cars are parked on the left. Now, the police superintendent for Braintree, who had been newly appointed, was totally and utterly not happy with the decision of these conditions. He stated that the spaces were frequently misused by motorists, them not parking properly, not parking within the lines, and also leaving their vehicles there sometimes days on end. However, the council believed people had a right to park there as long as it was done safely. The superintendent also goes on to mention the poor traffic conditions caused by market days, um, the illegal parking on Market Square and Great Square, as well as market traders not adhering to proper kind of stall setup, all making the traffic flow and the superintendent's job of traffic management very difficult. All this came to a head in 1934 when a public meeting was held between the council and the superintendent, and feelings were made very, very clear and very public, and nothing sadly being resolved. Council very quickly ended the meeting, agreeing to meet with the superintendent in private to discuss the issue further. I'm still not sure if it was ever resolved. But more on the superintendent a little bit later. The Lido, the Sun Lido bathing pool opened in 34 along Rain Road, and the site boasted of a wide range of facilities, including 2 swimming pools with the most up-to-date filtration plant, a boating lake with motor paddle boats, a refreshment pavilion, 200 changing cubicles, a sunroof, deck tennis courts, and even its own little shingles beach, with deck chairs provided by Crittal and Winterton. There was also a campsite, as well as car park, and towels and swimming costumes could be bought or hired, courtesy of Town Row. It would cost you 1 shilling, or £3.75 today, to use the pool once, but obviously a variety of tickets were available. And attendants were on hand to give swimming lessons for a moderate fee. The pool opened every day from 7 a.m. and when it grew dark, the floodlights were switched on. Then we have Market Square. Market Square has long been associated with the public meetings, and much uproar was provoked by the threats to ban meetings in 34 because Superintendent of Braintree believed that it wasn't safe to hold gatherings as the crowds obscured the newly developing traffic. But again, the opinion of the council was that it wasn't actually the case, and it's only since the advent of a new superintendent that any objection has been made to meetings held at the fountain. No more to be said. Of particular concern, though, of the piece for Braintree was when the fascist meetings that took place here during the 1930s. In 34, the British Union of Fascists visited the town, hoping to recruit more supporters after successes in Malden and Witham. Following a 2-hour speech during which the crowd kept a running fire of interruption and ridicule, the speaker invited questions, and you guessed it, was ridiculed some more. Later that year, another meeting was organised by the Black Shirts, but as soon as it had ended, a self-proclaimed communist stated that the Black Shirts were a pack of hooligans and told a lot of lies. One of the Black Shirts asked the man if he looked like a hooligan, to which the communist said, "Yes, you do. You have had your meeting, so you can clear off." Now, Braintree was actually notorious for its lack of support for fascists, and in one newspaper in 34, it was written that fascists in other places knew Braintree was a tough proposition for their creed. Following the Public Order Act of 36, the fascists weren't able to hold as many meetings without police intervening, so gatherings at Market Square were a thing of the past. The Embassy. Cinemas were a staple of the 20s and 30s, and the Embassy on Fairfield Road provided extremely popular. And in 35, the Embassy was the absolute embodiment of Art Deco style, opening on the site of the old Picture Palace. The cinema boasted an up-to-date heating and air conditioning system, car park, and its own cafe. And in 1920, and it had 1,812 seats, which is absolutely phenomenal. This is the beautiful foyer, and this is the cafe, which is an absolute embodiment of Art Deco style. Now, interestingly, the success of cinemas prompted a debate as to whether it should open on Sundays, and many believed this should remain a day of rest. In 1938, it was decided that the people of Braintree needed to vote. And in the lead up, the newspapers were full of conflicting opinions. The managers of Braintree cinemas obviously pointed out that other public services were available, such as radios, phones, railways, newspapers. So there shouldn't be a reason why cinemas couldn't be open. Interestingly, the Dean of Bocking also agreed, believing that Sunday openings was no sort of offence against the will of God. And in his eyes, cinemas should be instrumental in preventing moral mischief by keeping young people occupied on their days off. In the end, Braintree interestingly voted against cinema opening. There wasn't much in it, though. And then when it was announced from the town hall balcony, a crowd of 1,000 people, it was greeted with cheers and storms of boos. Interestingly, more people voted in this poll than the previous council elections. Obviously, the Dean of Bocking was not impressed, and he pointed out that the hypocrisy of voters, noting that those who had wanted to guard Sundays from the cinema, most were often those who never attended church or pursued their other leisure activities, such as golf on Sundays. The Vicar of St. Peter's in Bocking did support the result, stating that those who had voted for opening cinemas on Sundays showed an appalling bias to the side of paganism. After numerous takeovers, the embassy closed for good in 93, being acquired by Wetherspoons. And then finally, we end with the fountain. The site where the fountain now stands is where we saw those buildings on the aerial photo in front of the church. These dilapidated cottages were demolished in the slum clearances, and the view of St. Michael Church from the High Street became so prominent that, according to many, it was so beautiful that nothing should be built in its place ever again. George Bartram, another local politician, bought the land to prevent this from happening, and suggestions were being made to turn the site into a car park to accommodate the rise in car use. Interestingly, William Julian Courtauld intervened, purchasing the land off his friend, and having been inspired by a flowing fountain elsewhere, thought Braintree must have the first flowing fountain in Essex, as well as making it a memorial to King George V. Courtauld employed his trusted architect, Mr. Harris, as well as sculptor John Hodge for the design. The opening ceremony was held in July 37 with Sir William Llewellyn, the president of the Royal Academy, the gentleman pictured on the left, or the first of the three. And after his speech, he pressed a button and water flowed into the fountain basin amidst cheers from the crowd.